Well, good evening. My name is Dr. Bernardina Merritt, and I am the director of the Evelyn Lincoln Institute for Ethics and Society. And I want to welcome you this evening to this panel presentation of the Berlin Wall 30 years later. So just a brief history of the Institute. ELIES was established in the fall of 2008 through a generous grant from Emily and John Costigan. Emily Costigan is a 1964 graduate of Mercyhurst College, and the Institute is named in honor of her mother, Evelyn Jacobson Lincoln, who graduated from Mercyhurst in 1930, and is actually pictured above. The Institute began with a focus on three primary areas: socially responsible business practices, science and emerging technologies, and ecology and sustainability. While the Institute has broadened its scope over the last few years, these three areas remain at the heart of the work of the Institute. So, before I introduce tonight's panelists, I'd like to thank the Walker staff and the marketing department for all of their assistance in putting together tonight's program. I would also like to thank Mercyhurst University, President Victor, Provost Roberts, and Dean Riley Brown of the Hoffenmeyer College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences for their support of the Institute. And now just a little bit of background on our panelists. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Brian Ripley, a graduate of Macalester College and the Ohio State University. He's a professor of political science at Mercyhurst who teaches a wide range of courses in international relations and comparative politics. Dr. Fred Hoffman is former intelligence officer who was assigned in Berlin between 1988 and 1992 and experienced the fall of the Berlin Wall firsthand. He's currently an assistant professor of intelligence studies here. Next, we have Dr. Katie Duda, who's a graduate of Thomas Aquinas College and the University of Chicago. She teaches Russian at all levels, as well as a variety of Russian culture and literature courses. Her research focuses primarily on family efforts to preserve memory and alternative narratives within Soviet culture. And finally, Dr. Alice Edwards, a graduate of Middlebury College and the University of Pittsburgh. She's professor of Spanish at Mercyhurst, and her area of research is women's life writing in Latin America. So just a brief description of how we'll proceed tonight. I will be moderating the panel, so we'll begin with remarks from each one of the panelists to set the foundation for our discussion. And then have a series of prearranged questions, and we'll give the panel opportunity to ask each other questions, but it will also be opening it up to questions from the audience to provide all of you with an opportunity as well. So with all of that said, I will now turn it over to our panelists.
When the war ended, the decision was made, of course, what to do about Germany. The first half of the 20th century had been tragic. By the time World War II had ended, the height of that tragedy was only beginning to be discovered. The four wartime Allied powers were challenged with the task of trying to rehabilitate a country that had experienced tremendous economic, physical chaos, had displaced persons wandering throughout, had all kinds of other challenges ahead of them. The choice was made to divide the country into four sections representing each of the winning Allied powers, which you can see illustrated in the map closest to me. And Berlin itself also divided into those sectors. Now, if you're not a student of geography and history, you might not remember, or have not remembered, that Berlin as a city was sitting pretty well inside what was, at that point, the Soviet section of Germany, would ultimately become East Germany proper. So the decision to have shared governance over, an occupation and governance over Berlin meant that it was pretty well situated inside the Soviet territory of the country. Ultimately, it was the three sectors, French, British, and U.S., melded into what would become West Germany. Soviets held on to East Germany, and yet East Berlin was still accessible to the Western powers and citizens. It became a flashpoint. What made Berlin such a tremendous focus during the Cold War? Well, several factors. One thing, obviously, it's vulnerable, and the fact that it was subject to the possibility, really any time, of being cut off from the outside world. And famously, one of the early phases of the Cold War was the Berlin blockade in 1948. There was still hope, remember, in those early days after World War II, that there might be still an ongoing partnership between all of the Allied powers. It wasn't clear that the Cold War was going to break out in such a fierce rivalry, although Winston Churchill famously called it with the dissension of the Iron Curtain early after the war. But so the fact that Berlin was inside of hostile territory for the West made it a part of the flashpoint. Also symbolic. You now have a city which is increasingly side by side showcasing what's going on each side of the Cold War. People living close vicinity, close proximity to each other. And also, I would say, an anomaly. Khrushchev made a famous remark about Berlin, West Berlin, being much like a rotten tooth. And if anyone here has ever suffered from a toothache or a need of a root canal, you know that whatever else might be going on in your life, there's a focus on that particular situation. And so there's an obsession about what to do. Why is there a West Berlin so far into an East Germany? And I would say, by analogy, also probably Cuba during the Kennedy administration was a comparable kind of sore tooth, so close to the U.S. mainland. And so those two spots became famously part of the Cold War lore. By 1961, with Nikita Khrushchev as the premier of the Soviet Union and Kennedy as the very newly elected president, the Berlin situation emerged increasingly as a crisis. And for years there had been a brain drain. The route to the West for many well-trained, educated East Germans had been to go to West Berlin and then onward to Western Europe and beyond. Famous diplomatic meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev, one of the first outings for President Kennedy, although after the Bay of Pigs, but in June of 1961, showed an inexperienced president facing a fairly cagey and boisterous Soviet leader. And it looked clear that to Khrushchev that he could do pretty much what he wished to do, including perhaps building a wall to separate the two sides of the city. And in fact, lo and behold, by August of 1961, that event came about. First with barbed wire and wrecked roads, and then a more serious and subsequently more stable structure that I think one of my colleagues will talk more about in a few minutes. You all know it perhaps, but I think it's worth on the 30th anniversary this fall hearing a couple of pieces of famous rhetoric from the Cold War days.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties. And democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. I know of no town, no city that has been besieged for 18 years that still lives with the vitality and the force and the hope and the determination of the city of West Berlin. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The linguist us argue about whether you got the pronunciation exactly right, but President Kennedy clearly was endorsing the idea that those residents of West Berlin were not going to be isolated or abandoned during this period of the Cold War. In more recent times, or more recent, toward the end of the Cold War, we have another famous moment of presidential oratory. Some call Reagan administration's second Cold War, or the hyping up in the Cold War, much more rhetoric, much more pressure on the Soviets, and of course, this famous moment.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Before I turn over to my colleague, Dr. Hoffman, I will just say that George Tenet, one of the most noted Cold War strategists for the U.S., the father of containment, the author of several famous pieces of Cold War writing, said this in general about the East-West divide during the Cold War, but I think it applies specifically perhaps to East and West Berlin. It's been our conviction that if economic recovery could be brought about and public confidence restored in Western Europe, if Western Europe, in other words, could be made the home of a vigorous, prosperous, and forward-looking civilization, the communist regime in Eastern Europe would never be able to stand the comparison, and the spectacle of a happier and more successful life just across the fence would be bound in the end to have a disintegrating and eroding effect on the communist world.
Okay, good evening. So I want to basically focus on two things. I want to give you an idea of the pressures that led up to the wall opening and then actually what brought it about and when it happened. So first off, Erich Honecker, he was the General Secretary of the Communist Party in East Germany. He was a hardline communist. He was opposed to giving people a sort of economic reform and allowing people to travel. So there was a lot of discontent in East Germany, despite the fact that if you look at the entire East Bloc, including the former Soviet Union, the East Germans has the highest standard of living. But the level of discontent rose steadily in the late 1980s. Another thing is I'd like to point out, to follow up what Professor Ripley had talked about with regard to Berlin being in the middle of East Germany. Because not only did he have a wall, 103-mile wall around western Berlin, the western part of the city, he also had a fortified inner German border. So almost 900 miles of fortified border where a number of people lost their lives, were shot trying to escape, stepped on mines or other things over the course of a couple of decades. The other thing is basically West Germany and East Germany were essentially armed camps, because we had, at the time, in 1989, when the wall fell, we had around 385,000 military personnel in West Germany. The British and the French had personnel there as well, and then you had the Soviets that had even more in East Germany. So in the Cold War, if that would have turned hot, that would have been the focus of where most of the fighting would have taken place. So here, just to throw some numbers at you to give you a sense of just how many people lost their lives. I arrived in Berlin in December of 1988 as a young intelligence officer. My students out there are finding to believe I was ever young, but yes, indeed, I was 30 years ago. But within a couple of months after my arrival, there were two additional people who, one was killed and one died sailing a balloon over the wall and died in a crash. The wall actually consisted of more than just one wall. It was walls. There was an inner wall, an outer wall, sand traps, border guards, armed guards, and also it was interesting. I got to know a border guard over the years, and he was telling me they were basically trained to shoot another border guard, if it looked like that border guard was going to make an escape. So just imagine what kind of mindset is involved with that. So along with that, in East Germany, you had the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, or Stasi. Stasi was basically the KGB on steroids. They had as many as an estimated 1/3 of the population as their informers. They had people, if you lived in an apartment building, there was at least one or more people in the building who noted who came and who left. Last bullet there is a wall clock story. It was illegal in East Germany to watch West German TV, and a teacher tricked a student into giving away that the parents were watching West German TV, West German news, by asking the students to come up to the board and draw what the clock looked like on the news broadcast. The clock you see there is the East German clock, what they call the Strich, right? It's a line, whereas the West German TV had dots, and that's how they were able to come and arrest the parents for watching West German TV. So it was not a happy place in the sense that it was a surveillance state. If you bought a map, and I have maps of West Berlin that were produced in East Germany, or Berlin, and it shows the western part as a blank space, because they didn't want to do anything to facilitate people trying to escape. Gorby. So, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in 1985, realizes, even though he's a communist, that reforms are urgently needed. The Soviet Union economically is a basket case. It had a 10-year war in Afghanistan, or almost 10-year war in Afghanistan. It was draining the economy, and they had a lot of issues. So he brought along two major reforms: perestroika, which was restructuring the system, and glasnost, which is openness. And the East Germans did not experience these things, and they looked to Gorby as being their savior. They had high hopes for him, basically influencing the Honecker regime to reform. Key date, 2nd of May, 1989, the Hungarians opened up their border fortifications with Austria. Remember, Hungary was part of the East Bloc and bordered Austria, which was free. Okay? So now the East Germans, who were allowed to travel to fraternal socialist states like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, now they got a viable escape route. 4th of June, 1989, two things happened. One is the Polish anti-communist democratic forces received a lot of electoral votes and basically a majority in Poland. That was on the 4th of June. Also on the 4th of June of 1989 was Tiananmen Square massacre. So you have this pressure building in East Germany. The question would be, which way was it going to go? Was it going to go the way of Poland, where there were indications of democratization, or was it going to be a Tiananmen massacre scenario? So by August, because of the border fortifications being opened, now you've got East Germans traveling down to Hungary, and thousands would flee across the border, and the Hungarian border guards stood back and allowed it to happen. By early September, there were demonstrations in Leipzig in particular, but other East German cities as well. And you had significant tens of thousands of people demonstrating in the street. What they would do is they started off in the Lutheran churches there, and the people would come out into the streets, and they would start demonstrating, we're the people. Okay? And they felt that because they came out of churches that they wouldn't be repressed, and they had hope that their voices would be heard. The problem was that the Honecker regime was not very fond of what was going on, and they were contemplating military crackdowns. Freedom trains. So by August, a significant number of several thousand, it was over 4,000, East Germans basically invaded the West German embassy compound in Prague, okay, and camped out there for weeks in squalid conditions because an embassy is not set up to support that kind of population. And East and West Germany, they had some negotiations, because here's the thing, early October of '89, is the 40th anniversary of the East German founding, and Honecker wanted to have none of this going on in the background. So they negotiated a deal, but the fatal mistake the East Germans made was they wanted the trains that would transport individuals from Prague to West Germany to travel through East Germany, which proved to be a big mistake. So 4th of October 1989, Gorbachev comes to East Berlin, because as good communists, in the communist world, you don't go to the party comes to you, right? So Gorbachev comes to East Berlin, it's going to be a big party, and Honecker basically said to Gorbachev, and I paraphrase, hey, you know, we need your help. You've got all these military forces here, we need to do a crackdown, and Gorbachev declined. That was significant. So they have this big parade in East Berlin on the 4th of October. The next day, the first of these freedom trains start arriving in West Germany. So the pressure is growing, because here's the thing. With the exception of certain pockets in East Germany, like Dresden, you could watch West German TV. So people knew what was going on. They were at risking arrest and long-term detention if they watched TV, but they knew. They were well informed. So pressure was building. Okay, key date, 9th of October of '89. The East German government is preparing to violently put down the demonstrators in Leipzig. This is a Monday evening event, and the crowds are growing bigger and bigger, and they're making more unsettling demands in the eyes of the regime. And finally, the Honecker regime says, "That's it. We're going to mobilize the airborne forces, armored forces. We're going to send in extra police units." And there is a famous conductor, passed away several years ago. His name was Kurt Masur. Kurt Masur negotiated with the local party officials and said, "Please, let's keep this nonviolent." And that was a significant turning point because it could very easily, it was that close to being a killing man scenario. So, final thing I want to bring to your attention is, why did it happen on the 9th of November? So a Politburo member, Politburo is part of the inner circle around the General Secretary. His name is Gunther Schabowski, and Schabowski was interviewed about planned changes that would allow East Germans to travel up to 30 days a year outside of the country, which is a big deal. But he messed up, because the journalist said, when is the change going to take effect? And he said, they're going to take effect immediately. And I kid you not, East Germans started coming and descending on the border crossing locations in pajamas, whatever they were wearing. They ran out the door because, hey, if they can go into West Berlin, now's as good a time as any. And what ended up happening was paralysis. People at the border guard, the border crossings, they had no idea what to do. They were going back to headquarters with paralysis. And one officer made a decision at his location, they're going to let him through. And as the saying goes, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So once all the folks crossed into West Berlin at that location, all of the other locations opened up, and all the rest actually is history.
Good evening. I look at this talk as definitely a segue between our wonderful historical and political perspectives into some of our more contemporary perspectives. Excuse me. On November 9th, 1989, I remember exactly where I was. My parents, my 3 younger siblings, and I were in a specially marked car driving back to West Berlin from Dresden after a 3-day family vacation. I was 8 years old, and I'd spent half my life in Germany at that point and spoke and understood German as well and probably better than anybody else in the car. The radio was on, and my father, then an Army captain, obviously possessing more understanding than my 8-year-old self, asked me what the broadcaster had said. I, confused, said I thought that he said something about the wall opening. At 8, I knew nothing of protests or elections that led up to the fall of the wall. But I do remember the next day, my mom taking us down to the Tiergarten, from which you could see the Brandenburg Gate. I remember so many people, and somehow my mom getting us to the wall, and then strangers helping her lift me and my younger siblings up on top of it. I remember people being so excited and exceptionally kind and careful to help an American woman lift her 4 young children onto the wall. Though not properly our joy, those celebrants shared with us their joy. As an 8-year-old, the fall of the wall seemed both incredible and uncomplicated, an uncomplicated victory. As an American scholar who studies Soviet culture, I look back on that moment just barely appreciated by me at the time, and realized that my entire career is predicated on there being no wall. My schooling, my research would all have been unlikely and in many cases impossible without the opening of the material and ideological borders the Berlin Wall represented. More fundamentally, though, I look back at my memory of that event and I realized that November 9th and 10th of 1989 is when I became aware of history as embedded in events that are not about you and do not actively have to affect you directly to become significant in your life. Tonight I'm going to talk about something a little bit strange for Americans. I'm going to talk about the Soviet perspective and the lack of Soviet acknowledgement in the press in November of 1989. And why I'm going to do that for you this evening is because I'm going to foreground questions about narrative. What stories do we tell, and when does narrative become so rigid that it becomes weak? And I'm going to then take us back to my experience in November of 1989 and into 1990, the experience of myself and my family, and about the building curiosity about the world and those experiences that that sparked for me. For purposes of a 10-minute talk, it is very tempting to simply end this talk on the conclusion that I am standing here before you as a Russian professor because of my experience as an 8-year-old. But that is drawing some very straight lines with some crooked paths, and I hope not to be so pat in the end. Before I get into anything Soviet, I'm going to actually start from a novel that was written in 1999 by a Russian novelist named Viktor Pelevin. I believe that Pelevin offers us an image to consider the collapse of the Soviet Union or the end of the Cold War from the Russian perspective, and not in terms of its history, but in terms of its subjective experience. The beginning of the novel, where I take this paragraph from, it comes after a few paragraphs that introduce the reader to the protagonist of the novel, Tatarsky, who was the last generation of Soviet citizens to come of age before the Soviet Union completely collapsed. In the preceding paragraphs to the one I will read this evening, Tatarsky has committed his life to being a poet for the Soviet Union, and he has chosen to be a poet because he hopes to be a conscience for the Soviet Union and help the Soviet Union consider eternity. So now the Soviet Union has collapsed, and now he is wandering the streets. In the midst of the chaos of the multicolored, and he passes the shop window. There, in the midst of a chaos of multicolored Turkish handicrafts, stood a pair of unmistakably made Soviet shoes. Tatarsky felt a sense of sensation, of instantaneous, piercing recognition. The shoes had pointed toes and high heels and were made of good leather. They were light yellowish-brown, stitched with light blue thread and decorated with large gold buckles in the form of harps. It wasn't that they were simply in bad taste or vulgar. They were the clear embodiment of what a certain drunken teacher of Soviet literature used to call quote, our Gestalt. And the sight was so pitiful, laughable, and touching that tears sprang to Tatarsky's eyes. For Tatarsky, the shoes, made as they were of good leather and a sincere decoration of harps, are, quote, pitiful because it recalls his own sincerity in wishing to follow in the footsteps of the Soviet artist he so loved, like Boris Pasternak. His dream of attempting to participate in a conscience for the Soviet Union and provide human depth to its ideology by focusing on eternity is mercilessly undercut when he encounters these dusty shoes. Likewise, I propose that looking at the example of November 1989 Pravda tonight in terms of this gestalt. And like Tatarsky, we will notice that its inappropriate design and details. Not only do we see nearly no mention of the events of Germany, but what we do see, I think, can be both pitiful, laughable, and if you're so inclined, touching. In the interest of time, I will focus on one of these issues. The one I have on the slide is Friday, November 7th, 1989. The large headline that is tethered to the picture is from the All-Union Forum of Students, and it reads, "To confidently go along the path of perestroika." The line beneath it says, Gorbachev's answers to delegates' questions. Already, this large article is sort of ironic in the reading that we have of 2019, and it's somewhat painful. As the two panelists who have gone before me, by November 17th, 1989, we have thousands of East German youths raised in a socialist state, crossing borders where they had peers only years before dying. And again, Pravda makes no mention of this. Instead, it focuses on its own youth, who were there to discuss the future of the Soviet Union and the future of Soviet values. Looking at the text of the article, we can appreciate a sincere belief in the significance of perestroika and the desire to create a buy-in from young adults. Not presented here just because Pravda text gets really small and that's hard to project, but I'll read for you what I translated into English. The first questions were, what place does perestroika occupy in a global civilization? And in this aspect, I believe the questioner was thinking global civilization. Is perestroika subjective or objective? Gorbachev's answer reads, our perestroika is a sound investment in the progress of our civilization. If in realizing our socialist values, we try to reveal a new aspect of our society, which is characterized most of all by humanism, democracy, freedom, and the free development of personality, then perestroika will completely assist in the advancement of world civilization. Gorbachev's comments do not readily seem at odds with the motivations and energies simultaneously happening in Germany. And spreading throughout Eastern Europe, but by not acknowledging these events, the sentences read abstract, insignificant, and apart from any attempt to embed themselves or adapt to a concrete situation. Now I'm going to make an uncomfortable contrast, and that is and I bring up this contrast again because it had historical significance for particularly scholars of Eastern Europe last year, which was the 50th anniversary of the Prague Spring. That happened in August 20th, 21st. We usually mark those because that is the beginning of the suppression of the Prague Swing in 1968. On August 20th, 1968, Pravda was going to face things a little bit more head-on. That issue, it published TASS, which was the Soviet news agency's announcement and justification for the involvement of Soviet troops in the invasion of Czechoslovakia. According to that front page, the Soviets and other Warsaw Pact nations had then been asked to enter Czechoslovak territory and to bring their socialist brother back in line with those who were truly, quote, on the path to building communism, end quote, and push back against the counter-revolutionary forces at work in Czechoslovakia. What we call the Prague Spring was an 8-month attempt at socialism with a human face. And that, excuse me, that is when Alexander Dubček took the leadership of Czechoslovakia in 1968 and eased censorship. This set into motion within the Warsaw Pact nations a set of activities that made then General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev's mind uneasy, and he believed risked a domino effect in Eastern Europe. On August 20th and 21st, we see the first tanks in the streets of Prague, and at the end of the conflict, which would last a few months, there were 137 civilians dead, including one 18-year-old student who burned himself in Wenceslas Square. Despite the unmitigated disaster of the Prague Spring, and I say that not just as a sensitive American, but also this is true from contemporary Russians as well, that many conscious Russians were horrified at the activities of the Prague Spring. Pravda did its job by reporting on the realities in the streets of Prague at that time because it believed that it could, in print, create a narrative and involve that narrative in a justification for Soviet values. In this respect, then, the inability to cover or incorporate news of November 9th, 1989 in Berlin within the Soviet press reveals just how rigid their narrative had become, the limits of perestroika in the minds of the Soviet authors of this policy, and this rigidity is a symptom of the dying narrative that was the Soviet Union. So I'm going to jump back to my narrative for a moment. So what brought me to Berlin in November of 1989? To answer this question, as we have in a couple of the other talks, we must go back to 1945 and the post-war reality of Germany as an occupied country by 4 Allied nations. When these lines of demarcation were drawn, arrangements had to be made among the occupiers for joint missions to help, quote, to help one another monitor Germany. But these were very obviously and quickly just to monitor one another. The Soviet-American détente was codified in 1947 by the Kugen-Malinin Agreement to monitor the presence of weapons in Germany. And this brings me to the star of my story of my time in Berlin, which is my own father. And he was part of the last military liaison mission for the Americans in Berlin. Or sorry, in East Germany. The military liaison missions allowed for the presence of Allied officers and enlisted in Soviet-occupied East Germany, and there were Soviet officers and enlisted soldiers in American, British-occupied, and French-occupied West Germany as well. The reality of the mission the reality of the mission was that American soldiers in teams of 2 to 4 would enter East Germany over the Glienicke Bridge, which is the picture there on your bottom right. Okay? And then this bridge, called the Bridge of Spies, was featured in a Tom Hanks movie in 2015 of the same name, is famous because it is where the Soviets and Americans did exchange spies. But this is where we would cross. We would check in with our special Soviet handlers. Okay? And for the most part, my father's tours were done with other military personnel in uniform in special marked cars, and they would go and, from again my 8-year-old perspective, count the tanks. In addition, the mission also had, and you see that in the top picture on your right, a house that was always manned by Americans where they would host their Soviet handlers. You can see the fun of the Soviet handlers down at the bottom, and other official guests there as well, and just to have a non-touring presence in Potsdam. And Potsdam, by the way, is on the west side of Berlin. So, in preparing for this talk, I did talk to my father, and he wanted to let you guys know that there are a couple things that you should be aware of. So these are messages from my father to you. One is when I asked my father what he felt the relationship with the Soviet soldiers was in 1989 and 1990, he said, quote, very tense. He kept saying that, actually. And this was in very much counter-distinction to my own memories, because as you see, the drinking games that my father's engaging with the Soviet handlers, that is what I remember of Soviet soldiers from my youth, okay? Because obviously I did not go on the tours with my father, but those were the parties that were hosted through the mission. And the other thing that my father wanted you to know was that 1989 and 1990 was very confusing. When I told my father that I was speaking about the Soviet perspective of 1989, he said, nobody knew what was going on. How can you talk for 10 minutes about that? And so I relate that to you. One story in particular that he shared with me was that in March of 1990, when they were still doing tours, their last tour was done October 1st, 1990, 3 days before unification, that they noticed a huge influx of anti-aircraft weaponry coming into East Germany, and they had no idea what to make of that. And he said there was a lot of weapons coming into East Germany after the fall of the wall, indicating again that nobody knew what they were going to do after November 9th, 1989. All of this is to say is that, again, it is tempting to end this story, and it's not false to end this story, that as an 8-year-old, when I witnessed the retreat of Soviet influence from the perspective of 1990s Berlin, that is what set me on the path to be interested in those who left. But it's not quite as simple as that. Instead, I would like you to consider narratives more broadly. When as a child, I was lucky to be surrounded by various narratives and various perspectives. I only realized how strange it is as an adult that I had so many Soviet soldier stories as an 8-year-old, as a 7-year-old, etc. But I also lived in Berlin. I had experienced that joy of other people that had nothing to do with me, that I was not necessarily privy to, but was able to experience through their own experience of joy. And that made me think about that was even more formative than the historical experiences themselves. That being sensitive to other people's narratives has made me incredibly interested in narrative. And so I'm going to leave you just with the final thought on the importance of dynamic narratives, and that the distinction between significance and irony is really can be only a matter of time. Thank you. Oh, there was one more slide. Hold on. I'll see. Sorry, more of my own pictures. Apologies.
Good evening. My remarks tonight are grounded in the work of three people: a scholar, a border patrolman, and a poet. They're informed by the Sisters of Mercy's critical concern for immigrants and refugees, my work with the Multicultural Community Resource Center here in Erie, and my experience translating for asylum seekers from Central America in the 1980s and early 90s. As we discuss border walls in the 21st century, I want to emphasize that we're talking about human beings, not floods or hordes or caravans, but people whose lives are affected by walls, borders, and barriers in a way that mine has not been and probably never will be. As Mexican-American artist Guillermo Gomez Peña says, the border cannot possibly mean the same to a tourist as it does to an undocumented worker. People with social, racial, or economic privilege have an easier time crossing physical borders, but they have a much harder time negotiating the invisible borders of culture and race. So let's get started. This photograph, taken in 2015, shows the future United States Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Monica Crowley, posing at the Berlin Wall. The caption, "Walls Work," is brief but rather cryptic. First of all, when the photo is taken, the Berlin Wall has already been removed, except for symbolic remnants like the one she stands in front of. It's safe to say that this wall isn't working anymore. But it implies that the Berlin Wall at one time was a good example of walls working. It's also a tweet that was published in the context of an ongoing conversation about the construction of additional barriers on the US-Mexico border. And it seems to be implying that the success of the Berlin Wall is evidence for the future success of a US border wall, since after all, walls work. I, of course, take issue with both the simplicity of this tweet and the ideology behind it. Let's look for a moment at the purpose of border walls in the 21st century, a purpose perhaps which is very different than that of the Berlin Wall. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, there were 15 such border walls in the world. Today, there are nearly 70. Rather than a means to protect from foreign aggression or to mark a national boundary, today's walls are going up around the world in response to a growth in spontaneous international migration. Rhys Jones, in his article, Rhys Jones is my scholar. Rhys Jones, in his article for the Migration Policy Institute, states that at a time when international agreements and organizations like the United Nations ensure that most countries recognize each other's boundaries, over the last 30 years, walls are being used to stop the movement of civilian peoples. These are people displaced by economic disparity and environmental degradation in their countries of origin, by pressures of a larger world population, and by war, which has grown the forcibly displaced population by over 71% since 2005 to an unprecedented 70 million people, according to the UN Human Rights Council. Contemporary border walls are seen as a tangible solution to control the entry of migrants, and Jones concedes that they do reduce unauthorized entry when they cover short distances and are well guarded. As an example, he gives the section of fence between El Paso and San Diego. But that success is short-lived for several reasons. First, crossing doesn't always happen at crossing points, and many migrants enter closed territory with valid visas. In fact, NPR reported that for the 7th consecutive year, visa overstays exceeded illegal border crossings, accounting for nearly 62% of the newly undocumented. And I'm quoting here Donald Kerwin, the executive director of the Center for Migration Studies at New York University. He said, "This is not a blip, but a trend which has become the norm. As these numbers indicate, construction of hundreds of more miles of border wall would not address the challenge of irregular migration into our country. Far from it." At the other extreme, tunnels along the US-Mexican border thwart the fences on a daily basis. But a second and more important reason for the doubtful efficacy of border walls is that long stretches of border are difficult to guard. Physical barriers like walls simply shift the flow to less fortified areas. For example, in the US, to the remote deserts of western Arizona, or in the case of Europe when the Balkan land routes closed, to dangerous boat crossings. This shift to more treacherous territory increases the number of migrant deaths. There was a 50% increase in Europe, whose death toll shot up to 6,000 annual deaths. Francisco Cantu, my border patrolman, in his book, The Line Becomes a River, notes that another unintended consequence of hardened borders is an increase in human trafficking. He states, and I quote, "Every surge in border enforcement has brought a corresponding increase to the yield potential of each prospective migrant." The Border Patrol recorded over 6,000 deaths between Mexico and the US between 2006 and 2016. Cantu tells us, quote, "All along the border, coroners, county medical examiners, and forensic anthropologists struggle to identify thousands of remains." A wall, however, is an easier solution than the long and sustained effort needed to address root causes of migration. So despite all evidence to the contrary, some people continue to insist that a wall is a deterrent to migration. Certainly, that is the hope of the president, whose musings about the wall construction have been documented by New York Times reporters. His suggested addition of a moat, alligators, or spikes, or the option of shooting migrants, were taken as extreme, absurd, or unethical. But he is not alone in his desire to use every method to stop people from migrating in search of safety, work, or a better future for their children. This next is a clip of Priti Patel, who's the British Home Secretary. She gave this speech on October 1st of this year.
As Home Secretary, at this defining moment in our country's history, I have a particular responsibility when it comes to taking back control. It is to end the free movement of people once and for all. Instead, we will introduce an Australian-style points-based immigration system. Because let me tell you something, this daughter of immigrants needs no lectures from the North London metropolitan liberal elite.
Patel, the British Home Secretary, is a proponent of Brexit and a fierce opponent of the free movement of people, which is a non-negotiable piece of the European Union's achievement. The free movement of capital, goods, services, and people assured by European Union law erased border crossings within Europe. But, says Jones, quote, "the reality is that the EU borders were not removed in the 1990s, but simply moved to different locations. That is, to Europe's eastern edges and to the Mediterranean." In particular, he states, quote, "the most significant change in the Mediterranean region over the past decade has been the militarization of border enforcement." We see here the wall separating Melilla, this is a Spanish city in North Africa, from Morocco, and it could serve as a terrible model for President Trump's proposed wall. Migrants fleeing poverty and war in Africa make their way to this border. If they land on the other side of the wall, Spain is obligated to take their application for asylum. But if Spain can keep them from making it over the wall, migrants are trapped in a Moroccan no-man's land. According to the article 12 Kilómetros from the Spanish news site El Diario, migrants who attempt to cross it must first cross a highway, climb the first cyclone fence, which is 7 meters tall and tilted 10 degrees back towards Morocco, where they first encounter barbed wire, then anti-scaling nets halfway up, and at the top, unstable steel bands that make it hard to lean ladders and climb over. If they make it over the first fence, they then encounter a three-dimensional obstacle course of steel cables at different heights. After that, a second 6-meter fence, and if they manage to make it across, they have to negotiate alarms, blinding searchlights, motion-sensitive cameras, sirens, and finally, a high-pressure water and pepper spray system that, although it's been installed, hasn't been used yet, given concerns about the effect of pepper spray on people arriving exhausted and often with respiratory diseases. Now that's a wall. That's a wall that one would imagine would work. But as the author of the article states, quote, "It is a wall that should be practically impassable, and it is constantly overcome by those fleeing misery, fighting to survive." Jones, in his book, Violent Borders, Refugees and the Right to Move, states that, quote, "Borders that are open for corporations, capital, and consumer goods, but closed for workers and regulators, are creating dramatic inequalities in wealth and opportunity within individual countries and at a global scale." That's another page. I just realized I didn't show you the picture of the Melilla wall in reality. There's the wall in reality. Carl Jung spoke of the Iron Curtain as the prevailing symbol of the Cold War. And he said, "This boundary line bristling with barbed wire runs through the psyche of modern man, no matter which side he is on." Our 21st century borders and the tableau they create, the bodies on the shores, the bones in the desert, the children held in detention centers, also offer us a mirror of ourselves. Uruguayan writer and champion of open migration, my poet, Eduardo Galeano, wrote, "Since the beginning of time, butterflies, swallows, and flamingos have flown, fleeing from the cold year after year, and the whales swim in search of other seas, and the salmon and trout in search of new rivers. They travel thousands of miles on the free pathways of the air and water. The paths of human exodus, however, are not free. The fugitives of impossible lives walk in immense caravans. They travel from the south to the north and from the rising sun to its setting. They have been robbed of their place in the world. They have been stripped of their work and their land. They flee from war, but many more are escaping miserable wages and raised earth. Those who have been shipwrecked by globalization wander, inventing roads, wishing for home, knocking on doors. Doors that open magically for money to pass through are closed in their faces. Some manage to slip in. Others are cadavers that the sea delivers to the forbidden shores, or are nameless bodies lying under the earth of the places where they had hoped to arrive." What Galeano won't let us forget is that on the other side of these walls are people, human beings whose essential right to survival, to human flourishing, is undeniable. He reminds us that the only response to the stranger at the door is, in his words, my translation, "Come in, come in. The entire world will be your kingdom, and your legs will be your transport." Thank you. So first I want to thank all of our panelists again for their presentations that are framing this discussion for us. And then, before, we have some prearranged questions, but before we turn to those, I'd like to see if there are immediate questions in the audience.
Don't everybody ask at once.
All right, we'll give you some time to think about it. Let me ask a couple of questions of our panel that we've already developed. So first of all, for the whole panel, as you think about your particular approach to this question of the Berlin Wall 30 years later, what do you think is the most important lesson that we learned from Berlin? Again, don't all answer at once.
Is it okay if I answer? To me, it seems that it's clear that our memories are very short, and that the kinds of realities that people witness personally, and that were in the news and were in our history books, that it seems to me that we have a hard time keeping those realities, those thoughts, those things that happen in our heads as we make new decisions.
Well, I feel pretty idealistic when I look back at the triumphant fall of that wall, and it reminds me that, without sounding cliche, human spirit is pretty hard to stifle. You can have a massive security apparatus, you can have a well-built wall, you can have the world focusing on it, but individuals, dissidents, church members, playwrights, university professors, and lots of other people said, you know what, this wall's coming down.
One thing that comes to mind for me is we have a tendency to look back at historical events, and they seem to have more of a deterministic path than was really the case. So the opening of the wall, German reunification, these are two things that were not foregone conclusions at the time by any means. I tried to paint a picture of just how very easily we could have gone the other way in Leipzig. That all the preparations were made, all it would have taken was for one person in eastern Berlin to pull the trigger, literally, and it would have been a very different scenario. Or if Gorbachev had acquiesced to Honecker's request for military forces, because, I mean, they had the track record, right? East Berlin 53, Hungary 56, Czechoslovakia, as you described, in 68, Afghanistan 79. So, you know, if you go by history, the Soviets should have intervened. So those are a couple of things that stick out in my mind.
One thing that, again, it's hard to sometimes disentangle my own sort of position as an American, but always kind of considering Russian and Soviet perspectives, is the way in which borders can be constitutive of official identity, and how that is that there's often a easy scapegoating of when you want to violate those borders in some ways. That the Soviets were always very cautious of people who had any contacts with the West. So I am very interested in unofficial writers, and most of those people were proud Soviet citizens. They wanted to be Soviet citizens, but because they had affiliations with the West, maybe they published in the West, they were considered that because they had crossed those borders, that was considered making them a persona non grata. And I think that is a sort of very resonant lesson of the moment, that so much of our border discussion has to do with where do we draw the line of what it means to be European, what it means to be British, what it means to be American, and who is not those things. And so when we think about really taking away the easy answers that borders provide in that question about geographical space or ideological space, can we come up with sort of positive, that is just not no sentences, statements to fill into what those things mean?
Thank you. I would like to take it back to some of the more personal elements too, since drawing on those personal stories can help us really understand what it is we're facing. So, Dr. Hoffman, could you talk a little bit more about your personal experiences, since you gave more of a sort of historical perspective? Can you talk a little bit more about your personal experiences or the most vivid memories you have of that time?
Sure. So Professor Duda was 8 years old. She was in Germany at the time the wall fell. I was 5. Yeah. So what was interesting, well, a lot of things were interesting, but this fell out on a Veterans Day weekend, and because we were part of the Berlin Brigade, if you had a Monday holiday, you got Friday off, and the wall opened on Thursday night, and the weather was uncharacteristically beautiful in November. So that was one of the things that jumped out at me. So what that meant was when people came streaming across from East Berlin into West Berlin, they were in the streets, and basically traffic came to a halt, and finally the authorities shut down the streets, and basically you had just one massive pedestrian zone, like Kudamm. Kudamm was the main thoroughfare in West Berlin. And I remember being in a nice bar. It wasn't my idea, my friends dragged me in there. I had to use the restroom. So we were in this bar, and it was empty. And there's all these people on the street, and it dawned on us, these people had no money. So we went out in the street and literally pulled East Germans into the bar with us and said, your money's not good here. We're picking up for it. And just those, I mean, I get goosebumps even thinking about it. So, but that was just a lot of little vignettes like that along those lines. And also the morning that the wall fell, that morning, before this even unfolded, I was with a West Berlin couple. The husband's brother and his wife came over from Frankfurt-Oder, which was in East Germany, for the mother's funeral. Their mother had passed away in West Berlin. The husband and wife from East Germany came over. They were allowed to come for the funeral. And they had not seen each other or communicated directly since 1961 because the brother in East Germany worked for the railroad. The East German authorities regarded that as a person who had secret information, right? Troop movements, Soviet troop transfer, whatever. So they couldn't communicate by letter because the mail was read. They couldn't communicate by phone because phone lines were tapped. Any communication between them is indirect. So they come and they meet each other for the first time in like literally decades for the funeral. And the morning of the wall opened, I was putting them on the train, an East German couple, with their family, and they were convinced they'd never see each other again. And that was the same day that the wall opened. So that was a very moving experience for me and certainly for them.
So stepping back a little bit from the personal to the political again, can you, Dr. Ripley in particular, could you talk a little bit about how much credit you think the United States, and particularly Ronald Reagan, should take for the fall of the wall?
I'd say a little bit, but not the lion's share. I would say the United States was putting significant pressure, rhetorical pressure, defense spending, all kinds of other pressures on the Soviet system, and on some encouragement of the movements that were taking place in Eastern Europe. But I have to say, I give a lot more credit to the dissident movements that were taking place within each of the East European countries. And notice how quickly that domino effect took place in the fall of 1989. I was a professor in my very first semester at my very first university after graduate school, very pleased about teaching the Introduction to World Politics course. And all of a sudden, after 50 years of Cold War or so, half a century of Cold War, regimes began to fall, one after another. And people were saying, Dr. Ripley, what's happening here? What do you think is going to turn out? And of course, much like like you were saying about the Soviets, nobody really knows what's going on, but you have to kind of fake it sometimes. I would certainly give Gorbachev, I think it's already been said tonight, for not invoking the Brezhnev Doctrine, for not rolling tanks in, for not using violence to shut down, for not following Honecker's wish that there be another Tiananmen Square repetition. So there was surprisingly wise management of these matters at the time, including, I would say, in the subsequent years, really good handling of the reunification process by Helmut Kohl, fairly wise statesmanship by first President Bush, who should have been probably dancing up and down about joy, but knew that probably not being too triumphalist would be better to try to ease some of this transition. The U.S. had a role to play, but it was certainly more of the players in the area and the arena that I think get the credit for this.
Questions from the audience? I have more, but...
So specifically with German reunification, could you sort of discuss a little more about, at least my understanding, it was a very uphill battle for Kohl to convince the former Allied powers and now NATO nations to really support a unified Germany. I mean, after all, Germany was founded on a French defeat, and they had, while losing both world wars, they certainly caused giant damages to Europe and Americans. So I guess sort of just discuss how it was really a challenge for them to do that.
Well, sure. It's a very, very good question. I mean, if you think about it, in 1989, somebody who was 65 years old still had a recollection of World War II, right, as a young person. And if you're a Soviet, Professor Duke talked about this in great detail, but this is part of their DNA. I mean, we talk about Washington crossing the Delaware and Christmas Eve to defeat the Hessians, my people, probably they rest. So, you know, there are things that are part of our national narrative. Right? Well, their defeat of Nazism was really important. That was like the highlight, the high watermark of the Soviet era, culturally, right? So, to face the prospect of a reunified Germany and the potential for NATO to migrate towards Soviet borders, right, was not a happy thought. So there was some convincing that had to be done on that side of things. The British and the French, obviously, they also had, experienced 2 generations of fighting the Germans. So, wasn't Churchill said the Germans are either at your throat or at your feet? Or at the bar. That's my view. But, so this was a legitimate concern, and it took a lot of behind the scenes, and Professor Ripley really hit on it, the fact that I give a lot of credit to our government at the time for being very subtle and not doing a victory lap, for one thing, okay, which would have offended a lot of people and rubbed people the wrong way at a very delicate time. But doing things behind the scenes to enable reunification, which even within Germany was not a foregone conclusion. People are arguing, saying, we should let this Germany be another Austria or another Switzerland, and we don't need to reunify. Germans saying this. So the fact that Germany reunified, like I said, was not at all a foregone conclusion in 1989.
I think that Professor Uter touched on briefly about the physical and ideological repercussions of having a wall, specifically the Berlin Wall. And that kind of, I guess, can be associated with strict borders in general. Would you see, or this is also directed to the entire panel, any kind of repercussions with eroding away of borders in a geopolitical sense that refers to state sovereignty?
I can give an answer that I don't have an answer. One topic that comes up in class all of the time is the current situation in Ukraine. And so clearly we have in Eastern Europe a kind of crisis of what really sovereignty entails, particularly for former Soviet states, and where that respect lies. So, as personally, I can look at Ukraine and say, obviously we need borders, like that seems moot. But what does that mean, and what does that mean in a contemporary context as well? Because, again, I'm just going to kind of keep my hobby horse for Ukraine, and I'd be interested to hear everybody else's perspectives. But one of the other fallouts from Ukraine is the current brain drain on the other side of Ukraine. That because of the war in Ukraine, that most working age Ukrainians cannot find a job and are working elsewhere and trying to send money home. That is also a reality of a kind of porous nation that cannot establish its own sovereignty, that cannot determine its own borders. And that, of course, is a problem. That is a problem for that area, and that will continue to be a problem for Eastern Europe until, that figures itself out. But I will.
Well, I think you're touching on one of the most important dynamics right now in global politics. We have one of the most robust, international, globalized world we've ever had in terms of money, ideas, products crossing all kinds of borders all the time. And we have some of the strongest populist movements, pro-sovereignty movements, political parties, political leaders taking office around the world. That tension is very real, and it's underlying a lot of different disputes the world. So, you know, yet to be seen how this works out, but that's the dynamic I'm watching.
Well, I'm not an expert in this area, but I will say that, you know, what Rhys Jones says is that he's definitely a champion of pretty much of open migration. But what his argument is that borders, particularly hard borders, are violent, that they in and of themselves create violence, and it's ecological violence, environmental violence, as well as violence towards, you know, people who are trying to cross. I feel consistently frustrated when I watch what's going on now, and I mentioned it in the talk, in the what seems to me to be the refusal to deal with root causes, to try to create some sort of hemispheric relationships, series of relationships and plans and also that would somehow deal with the reasons people leave. The vast majority of people want to be home, right? And yet we do need people to travel and migrate and work and share their expertise and their talents. And there has to be a better way to do it, because certainly our immigration system, as well as the border situation, is not helping.
So this might be too general a question and might not be able to answer, but how do people move on from this? I mean, specifically in terms of how people, how you talk about coming down from being South to the biggest wars in human history. Basically said that these deaths from randomly and no idea they were being surveyed at times. I mean, it was mentioned that like a child was utilized to grow up with their parents. Like that has to be overly traumatizing thing to go through. They saw the peers get killed. They were separated from family members. Like, how do you move forward that sort of situation?
Well, it's interesting because even though physical borders went away pretty much in 1989, psychological ones didn't. So it was interesting, just to give you a quick anecdote. There's a chain of clothing stores in Berlin, and I'd gone to a West Berlin shop, and they didn't have something I was looking for in the right size, so they said, go to our East Berlin office. So I walked in, and it was the same exact store, same exact decorations, they were wearing the same uniforms. Attitude was totally different. Might as well have dropped into a different planet. Because the thing is, these were folks who were raised, socialized, and educated in a very different system, different mindset. Okay? So even today, there is a difference, a noticeable difference, when you go into the former East and go into small towns and villages and talk to some of the locals there. It doesn't take very long. And I don't mean this necessarily in a pejorative way, that what they're saying is bad. Right? It just that thinking is different. It's taken literally a generation for Germans to come together, and they're still not 100% there yet. And this is 30 years later.
It's a very perceptive question about the politics of memory and the politics of reconciliation. When things turn out even as you want them to, and there is an end to a conflict, there still are those bridges that have to be rebuilt, and knowing what to do, for example, with people who were mistreated and tortured, people who were falsely imprisoned or imprisoned under political charges for years, people who said things or did things that they now regret and are now public. That's a difficult reconciliation. You're making a great point.
Yeah, to build off of that just a little bit, there have been a lot of local scandals in places like Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, in addition to former East Germany, about just who was complicit in the system. And because there was such a heavy recruitment for information, that was everybody's neighbor. And that included people like Lech Walesa, who led the Solidarność movement in Poland, was implicated. I mean, there's a lot. This goes in all directions and has really been used in contemporary Eastern European politics often as a weapon. Like everybody has this smear campaign. If you're old enough to have been an adult before 1989, chances are you worked for the wrong person at the wrong time, and it has become a very barbed situation there. So it's still a live wire for a lot of people and for a lot of consideration about who to trust and how to trust your neighbors, and how the rug gets pulled out from under you when you realize, and mom was one too, that kind of terrible realization.
We have time for just one more question.
It's been very thought-provoking, a little bit emotionally. I think about those migrants coming in from Mexico and across the Mediterranean. And I'm going to ask a little laughable question. Have any of you seen the movie Goodbye Lenin?
Yes.
And I would recommend that you recommend it to your here to see that. We saw it in Aachen, and only me, because with a group of young people, mostly like the people here, and there are a few older women like me, and we laughed our full heads off. Because we too had lived in, I lived in Berlin for 6 years during the wall time.
All right, I want to thank our panelists again for their presentation this evening. Thank all of you for coming. The next event for the Ethics Institute is November 20th at 7 p.m. again in Walker for Native American Heritage Month. We'll be showing the film Link of Betrayal, and there will be a panel afterwards with members from the Seneca Nation. Have a wonderful evening.